How did divine intervention and the role of the Christian faith influence the outcome of World War II? Joining me now to discuss this, Dr. Jerome Corsi, author of No Greater Valor, The Siege of Bastogne, and the Miracle that Sealed Allied Victory. Dr. Corsi, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to see you again.
It's great to be back with you, Tony. Thank you very much. God bless.
Before we dive into the history, I just want to get your reflections, your thoughts on this 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion.
Well, it's a very emotional day for me. I was raised by the World War II generation. My father was in Army, Air Force during World War II. And this is a day we owe so much to those who gave their lives on D-Day and so many other battles in American history. I mean, it makes me emotional just to think about it, quite frankly. And freedom is not free. Ronald Reagan reminded us of this. It can be lost in one generation. And to me, I wrote this book, No Greater Valor, to answer the question of whether or not God intervenes in human affairs, the very question you posed to begin with, Tony. And I resolved, after studying this battle, and I put intensive study in this battle. I was in the National Archives. I actually went to the 101st headquarters, at their current camping headquarters, and looked at the museum, spent a considerable amount of time at the museum. They have a Bastogne museum. And I did an enormous amount of research for this book, and I really did conclude that God does intervene. And even thinking about it today, it does make me emotional to reflect on what I concluded and the work I put into this book to elucidate that story.
Well, and I've read your book, and I found it fascinating, and that's why I want to have this conversation today, because, in fact, in just a few moments, I'm going to have a World War II veteran who was at the Battle of the Bulge. He's in his late 90s, but he's going to join us momentarily. There was evidence that God did intervene at that very turning point where Hitler made he pushed back after the D-Day invasion, the Battle of the Bulge. That was really the most decisive point in World War II, was it not?
It was. I mean, it began on a Saturday, December 16th, 1944. It was just 9 days before Christmas, and the Germans opened up with this enormous artillery barrage. And at 5:30 in the morning, the Wehrmacht came through the Argonne forest. We did not know, the American soldiers had not gotten any idea that the Germans had amassed this massive tank and artillery attack as a last ditch to try to save Hitler from defeat. And so when this onslaught came through the Argonne, everyone in our lines was not ready for it. We had been pretty much in a stand down going into winter quarters. And it turned out that this one little town of Bastogne, which had these highways crossing through it in Belgium, became a center point. Because if you could hold that town, you could hold the roads that were needed for the Germans to advance. And their whole idea was to advance up to Antwerp, to cut off the American supplies, and to try to negotiate a peace. So in the very first hours of this, when the battle starts, the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were in bivouac at a place called Camp Mermelon, and the attack came through, and Eisenhower and Bradley and the command said, who do we have we can send quickly to Bastogne to relieve these troops, because we've got to hold Bastogne. So the call went out to the 101st and bivouac, and they said, we're going to send trucks up there, and you guys better get ready because you're going to Bastogne. At first, they didn't know for sure where they were going, but they knew they were headed in that direction. Well, it turned out that the general commanding the 101st, Maxwell Taylor, was back in Washington briefing the Pentagon, and the commander, it was General McAuliffe. It turned out to be the exact right commander, because he had served in the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. He was artillery commander. He was extremely good with artillery, but he wasn't the commander. Now, when the order came, they did not have winter clothes. They pulled up all kinds of trucks. They were assembling whatever weapons they could get. And McAuliffe got in a command car, and he had the intelligence with his command unit to drive off. He was going to say, where are we going? He wanted to get there first. That was critical in the battle. He knew to show up. But the Americans in the night, traveling from Cap Mermelon up into Belgium to get to Bastogne, all of our troops were fleeing in the middle of the night. And our troops in these trucks, 101st, going into battle, did not have winter equipment. And the troops leaving battle, they asked them for their weapons. They asked them for their clothing. They were scavenging because they had nothing going into battle. So that's the first real miracle, in fact, that when General McAuliffe got to Bastogne, he was headed to the wrong place, and they stopped him. The sentry stopped him and said, General, you're going to Bastogne, and it's only right over here. So he got to Bastogne first, and he picked out the exact right place for the 101st to bivouac when they got there. And that next morning, he sent them into battle. And it's a remarkable story because he was an artillery commander, not the one who should have been the commander. He set up the defense of Bastogne like a castle. He put all of his artillery in the center. So wherever the Germans attacked, he could pivot the artillery to meet that attack. And that was the first miracle. He should not have been the commander. He was the commander. He got there. He managed to fight off the Germans, and he held. And then as it got into winter, and this one of the most horrible winters in history in Europe, in recent history, 1944, the snow was tremendous. Our troops were outnumbered, and McAuliffe began defending Bastogne.
So we got through one miracle. Let's move to the next, and I want to talk about Patton's prayer. He's not known to be one who would pray, but he really pressed in and challenged the men to pray.
Yes, he did. In fact, so this Battle of Bastogne, they were surrounded. The 101st was completely surrounded by the Germans. They were cut off, and they were using their last supplies. And it was winter, and they were running out of ammunition. So a couple things happened. First of all, Patton said that he was going to relieve the 101st. He was going to bring his Third Army up through the Alps in winter and get to Bastogne and relieve them. And before he left, he had the chaplain. He called the chaplain in and said, write me a prayer. Chaplain said, well, I can't write you a prayer to win in battle. He said, well, write me a prayer for the conditions to be right where we can fight a battle. Chaplain read the prayer, and Patton had that prayer printed and handed to every one of the troops in the Third Army coming in this massive advance to save Bastogne. At the same time, in Bastogne, they were encircled, and the Germans came out of their lines on white flags. McAuliffe was sleeping that morning, and they woke him up and said, General, they're coming in under white flags. Well, McAuliffe, who was surrounded, running out of ammunition, thought they were coming to surrender because they're coming in under white flags. They said, no, General, they're not coming to surrender. They want you to surrender. And McAuliffe said, nuts. Well, so that word, that electrified, they tried to tell, what are we going to tell these Germans? They finally said, well, General, what you said to begin with was pretty good. So General wrote nuts all over their demand to surrender, and he handed it back. The Germans didn't know what it meant. They said, he's not surrendering, so we're going to take you back to your lines. We're not surrendering. I get emotional every time I tell this story. This electrified U.S. troops around the world. That McAuliffe said nuts to the Germans. So Patton is advancing, and the weather, just as they're running out of ammunition at Christmas time, breaks, and the C-47s can come in and do an airlift. And General McAuliffe, they get relieved eventually by Patton, who does break forth. When Patton gets there, General McAuliffe said, we didn't need to be relieved. We were fine. Well, this was a remarkable story. I mean, it's still one of the greatest stories of World War II. The heroics of the 101st to be surrounded and to hold out. But the key to the entire story is prayer. They trusted in God, and they prayed to God. And McAuliffe, when it was over, said, God won this victory. He attributed the victory to God. That's why I wrote the book. Because in my view, God did intervene, and we were on the right side of God at this time. And in fact, I think it's a lesson for us today that you cannot succeed without God. God is fundamental. God rules.
Right. And Dr. Corsi, when you look at that, and of course I've read your account and I've read other accounts of Patton's prayer, we've disarmed our military in terms of what it takes to win today, where if a general were to print a prayer and pass it out and tell all the men to be praying it, good chance he'd get relieved.
Probably court-martialed. You're not allowed to do that. Well, once we abandon God, God abandons us. And one of the great troubles we are in this country is that we have sinned against God. We've sinned. We've killed millions of babies since Roe v. Wade. Only God can give life. We can't take life away. It's a sin against God. We've taken God out of our schools since the 1940s. When I end my podcast, I end it every day saying the remedy to this is 2 Chronicles 7:14. We've got to get down on our knees and ask God for forgiveness for letting this country get to this point. And I say, well, God will hear our prayer and heal our land. That's what 2 Chronicles 7:14 says. God will do 90% of the work, just as God did in the Battle of Bastogne. If it had not stopped snowing, the troops in Bastogne would have run out of ammunition and they'd have been overwhelmed before Patton got there.
And the significance of that to the entire war effort?
Because this battle was electrifying. I went back and read the New York Times reports on the reports that were coming to the troops. I went into the archives. This was a internationally celebrated battle that lifted us in saying we can make the final push and we can defeat Hitler. Because Hitler could have won the Battle of Bastogne. We could have lost World War II. We were caught unawares. Hitler had the upper hand. And it took the bravery of these people at Bastogne and Patton and his troops. There was great heroic effort made here. People sacrificing lives in the middle of winter, freezing to death, running out of food, running out of ammunition, but yet praying, trusting in God. And that was the ultimate victory. This was a great indication in World War II, one of the many instances of miracles, but the one most celebrated because it was the most impossible. This was an impossible victory, and McAuliffe and those troops pulled it off with the help of God and Jesus Christ, to whom they prayed every moment of that battle. And it was my honor to write this book, and it still makes me emotional to recall the story. It always did. From the time I was a child, I heard the story, and I resolved to write this book when I was about 10 years old, and I finally got the chance to do it. I thank God for that chance.
Well, it's an amazing book, No Greater Valor, The Siege of Bastogne and the Miracle That Sealed Allied Victory. Dr. Jerome Corsi, always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on this special day.
Thank you, Tony. God bless, and great honor to all the men and women who fought in World War II and secured our freedom.
Absolutely.
Thank you, God.